we'll be discussing, as promised, the Sri Lanka debt default crisis, or looming debt default crisis, I should say. All of this, as the opposition in the country has said, this is happening because of the political crisis in the country ever since President Sirisena ousted Prime Minister Wickremesinghe in favor of Mahinda Rajapaksa. Let's discuss all this with our esteemed guests who are joining us to discuss this further. We're joined by Mr. Weerakoon Wijewardena. He is a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He's joining us via Skype. Sir, thank you for joining us. We're also joined in the studio by Dr. Salman Shah, who is an ex-finance minister of Pakistan. Dr. Shah, we appreciate you coming into our studios today here in Lahore. Mr. Wijewardena, I'll start with you, if I may. What do you make of the current situation in Sri Lanka vis-a-vis the debt payments which are due at the beginning of January? Do you think Sri Lanka will be able to meet its obligations?
Well, of course, we see Sri Lanka has a huge problem of debt repayment in 2019, 2020 and 2021, over the 3 years. The total debt repayment plus the payment of interest. What it means is that the message given to the investing community is that it will be highly risky for them to invest in foreign debt in Sri Lanka. So as a result, there is a problem of rollover cost. But on top of that, there is a constitutional crisis also has not emerged because there is no budget that has been presented for year 2019. And there is no any likelihood of the budget being presented to Parliament during the balance part of the year. And as a result, the government has to come on a temporary arrangement called vote on account system, in which the government will be able to extend the payment for another 3-month period based on the government's revenue and government expenditure in the last quarter of year 2018.
Right.
The problem here is that since the government doesn't have a majority in Parliament, it is likely that when the government presents such a vote on account, it will be defeated by the opposition.
Dr. Shah, many of our viewers, I'm sure, are watching this right now and trying to understand exactly what defaulting on debt payments means, all of the above. As a macro issue, I know that Pakistan has gone through this in the past as well. Just put into context for us, if you can, what this means and how important this is for any country.
First, I think Sri Lanka's credit rating has been downgraded from B1 to B.
Yes.
But it's not a default rating. I don't think that Sri Lanka is really, there's any chance of an imminent default.
Okay.
Otherwise, their rating would have fallen a lot more than just going from B1 to B.
I see.
But having said that, obviously, if there's political turmoil and there's no government in place, and you have to negotiate with the IMF, and if the IMF has suspended negotiations, then you need a government in place to be able to negotiate with the IMF so that they can stop the downward slide towards a crisis.
Right.
And of course, I mean, behind all of this is that Sri Lanka is a very strategically placed country right in the heart of the Indian Ocean, and all the sea lanes are crossing right near its waters, and of course there's a lot of competition between particularly China and India for influence in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure behind that, since the Indian Ocean is a huge place, and there is a huge rivalry going on between the U.S., China, and other powers. So I would assume that some of the problems or some of the opportunities which Sri Lanka has are due to these geostrategic issues as well. Now, Sri Lanka has been performing well in the past in the context of South Asia. And if they do get a stable government, I think they should be able to handle this crisis fairly easily.
What is your opinion, Dr. Shah, on debt in the form of IMF or otherwise for any country really, and in the context of Sri Lanka or any other countries that I'm sure you're aware of, especially with your expertise. A lot of people argue against such debt, saying that it's a vicious cycle which a country gets stuck into, and it's very hard for a country to find themselves out of this. What do you say to that?
I don't think that's true. I think that IMF is one of the premier global institution, a lender of last resort, particularly for countries with problems of balance of payment type issues, which of course Sri Lanka is also facing at the moment. And so it is the premier organization with which countries do engage with. And there are 180 countries who are members of the IMF.
Right.
And even if the United States has probably the largest voting right, it's only about 16% of the shares are held by the United States, and even China has a say in the IMF.
Right.
And IMF itself is also quite keen to keep its independence and to be able to show to the world that it deals with countries on the basis of professionalism and on basis of economic principles. So I think it would be wise for the Sri Lankans to continue dialogue with the IMF so that they can work out a reasonable program of adjustment and reforms, which probably Sri Lanka needs.
Indeed, and I wanted to put that question then to you, Mr. Wijewardena. Do you think that your country is putting those reform plans as requested by any lender in the country in place at this point? Do you think that has been continuing at a satisfactory pace?
Yes, of course, what had been actually suspended by IMF is the last installment involving the ongoing extended fund facility of 1.6 billion, some 1.6 billion US dollars. And amount-wise, what has been suspended is not that much because the amount is just some 250 million US dollars. But before the suspension, there was an IMF mission in Sri Lanka. That mission had expressed its satisfaction about the reform program which the government had undertaken in terms of the agreement Sri Lanka government had entered with IMF at the time this EFF was given to Sri Lanka. So there was no any question about the reform program at that time. But of course now what has happened is, since there is no any legally constituted government and there are certain issues relating to the government in power today, and as a result the IMF has simply as a precautionary measure has suspended the release of the last installment. But it has a long, very important impact on Sri Lanka because the IMF certificate is important for any borrower willing to go to international markets and raise money because it gives the good behavior certificate.
When we talk about reforms that are demanded by lenders, be it the IMF, be it the Chinese, be it whoever is lending to a country such as Sri Lanka, many times when we talk about, for example, the example of Greece, for example, what happened in Greece and the EU lending, the EU IMF lending it money, and the austerity measures it had to bring in place. Those remain obviously very politically unpopular. And I wonder, how do you, as somebody who has been heading finance, how do you balance that?
Greece was probably a unique case that it had built up a huge debt, which was allowed to be accumulated by Greece, and then it was unable to service that debt. And primarily, the debt was to European banks. So in a way, Greece had the European Union kind of very interested in getting them out of that jam because most of their own banks were involved in that. And they did work out a program with Greece, and which was a very difficult program because apparently the debt was extremely large. I don't think that is the situation with Sri Lanka.
Right.
From Sri Lanka's point of view, the main issues may be accumulation of debt through the fiscal deficit being a bit out of control, and maybe their trade deficit.
Yes.
I'm not too, I don't have the numbers to really look at whether their problem is coming from.
Yep.
But the Sri Lanka, as I said, has a unique position in the Indian Ocean, and it has almost a free trade agreement with India, so it has a very large market in India where they can export their surpluses, and they have a very good relationship with China, which could be a very big buyer for China, for Sri Lankan products.
Right.
But we don't know whether this debt is really owed to China or is it owed to the rest of the world. So if it is owed to China, then it would be a bit of issue for China to resolve it, because if that's a very big debt and they have a port which now they have on almost a 100-year lease on that port, and they are trying to make that functional, and
yes.
from that there may be more export opportunities. So we'll have to wait and see whether this is really something which China has to bail them out, or is it India which is going to bail them out, or is it the IMF which is going to do all the reforms which are necessary for Sri Lanka. My impression has always been that Sri Lanka in the South Asian context has been fiscally more responsible, but lately I have not seen the numbers, so
yes.
I can't comment that how bad the situation is. But I do see that Sri Lanka has a good, solid geopolitical strategic value, and that should help it to solve its problems on debt, particularly if it is one of debt to India, China, or some other large bilateral loan, or is it part of the loans from the commercial banking system?
Right.
But it is a country which should do well.
Okay.
And historically, Pakistan has had a very good relationship with Sri Lanka, and there is great potential for increasing our trade relationship with Sri Lanka. Historically, we have supported them through their civil war, and in that sense, we have some political connections with Sri Lanka. But now, within the context of CPEC in our own country and their Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, maybe there are some opportunities of trade between Pakistan and Sri Lanka in all of this.
Mr. Wijewardena, I was reading, and you can of course correct me if I'm wrong on this specific point, Mr. Wijewardena, that it is the Chinese, in fact, that the Sri Lankans are looking towards to bail them out for this specific payment that is upcoming in January. What do you make of the fact that the Chinese are going to be helping the Sri Lankans at this point, if that does occur, of course, if the Chinese agree to it? And secondly, do you believe, Mr. Wijewardena, that countries such as Pakistan, those regional countries, can play a supportive, helping role at this time of crises?
First of all, we are all members of this, what is known as this Asian Clearing Union. And when we become a member of the Asian Clearing Union, we are in a position to import and export to the member countries without having to pay in hard foreign currency. But simply the accounts will be balanced in the Asian Clearing Union, and we will have to settle it once in every 3 months, only the balance, the outstanding balance. So in that context, not only from Pakistan, from India, from Iran, from Bangladesh, from all the countries who are members of the Asian Clearing Union, we are in a position to import and export without having to have hard foreign currency to pay for it. But the total debt that is to be repaid by Sri Lanka in the next 12-month period comes to about 5.5 billion US dollars, of which about 1.5 billion we owe to sovereign bond investors. The balance, the 4 billion, of the balance 4 billion, but 1 billion is owed to domestic commercial banks who have invested the foreign currency reserve that they are having in Sri Lanka government development bond.
Yeah.
There's no difficulty for Sri Lanka government to recycle it because those are actually the monies are within the fund. The balance part, when we examine the balance part, about 4 billion comes from various creditors, including China. And that is where we may have problems. But before the constitutional crisis, the central bank had already negotiated with the Import-Export Bank of China to get $1 billion from China. And another syndicate loan was to be raised from China, another 1 billion. So as a result, there is a possibility that Sri Lanka would be able to marshal all these sources in order to build up the required foreign exchange balances to repay the loan. I don't foresee any loan default as such, except this constitutional crisis, and because of that reason, Sri Lanka government will not be able to do it constitutionally. But of course, if the
right, Mr. Wijewardena, if you allow me to come in here, because I find that both of you gentlemen are in agreement that there probably will not be a default at this point. But one of the economic experts I was reading today, Mr. Wijewardena, said, and he's a Sri Lankan economic expert, he said that pretty much Sri Lanka, like many of these other countries who find themselves with such debt, have been living beyond their means as a whole. And that the Sri Lankan public, for example, needs to understand now that they really do need to tighten their belts. And this is a narrative that we heard, for example, when it came to Greece as well. That's why I brought up the example of Greece earlier, that many people said that Greece has been living beyond its means for many, many years and now needs to tighten its belt. It needs to come back to reality. Do you think that is the case with Sri Lanka as well?
Yes, of course, that's the case, because ever since we have been independent from the British from 1948, Sri Lanka governments had been running deficit budgets amounting to about, say, 5 to 6% of the GDP. And as a result, the total public debt at the time of independence was just 14% of GDP, but now it stands around 79 to 80%. So the debt accumulation has been a result of living beyond our means, and that has been a fact. And also that's the truth. What is necessary right now is to, as you have suggested, go for a debt tightening program in which the examples would be given right from the very top, from the president downward, so that the people would be able to buy the idea that they have to cut down their total consumption levels. That is the long-term solution for the present debt problem in Sri Lanka. Right. But given the political background in the country, as is the case with most of the South Asian countries,
yes,
the politicians are the people who have been spoiling the members of the public, the voters. So as a result, when one government tries to tighten the belt, the opposition parties always go to town by promising various types of handouts and goodies to the members of the public. Now, one good example is immediately after the new government was formed under President Maitripala Sirisena, they offered some 12 odd areas handout which the government budget could not afford to offer. And at the same time, they had been now reducing the fuel prices, again not according to any scientific formula, but according to the whims and fancies of the politicians in power. Now these are, I think, critical issues which all these countries are facing, not only Sri Lanka. I find India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, this has been an eternal problem, and the solution to all these things is to go for a economic reform program in which we might gradually cut down the consumption without imposing an
if you allow me, Mr. Wijewardena, I wanted to leave that as a point right before we go into a very short break, because I think that that's a very pertinent point you make, and I'll ask Dr. Shah about that right as we come back from this break. This about the need for economic reform specifically within the South Asia region. We'll discuss this further right after this break. Welcome back. You're still with The Scope, and we're discussing Sri Lanka's possible debt default crisis, and of course the entire issue of debt in general, specifically within this region and beyond. Dr. Shah, I wanted to put to you the point that Mr. Wijewardena made right before the break, and that is of this region, South Asia. Have we been living on borrowed money beyond our means for many years?
Well, I think that, of course, reflects in your credit ratings, and if you are saying that Sri Lanka has been downgraded to B, that would be one indication of this living beyond the means. But I think that Sri Lanka has gone through a very major war, and then it is now recovering from that war, and also it is developing at the same time. So I think that our fiscal management systems are not that robust to accommodate everything. You need a lot of money for development purposes. That means your collection agency has to be very good. Your tax policy has to be such that you can raise the money, and yet you can create the investment environment for development. And so I think it is not an easy task to do. But in general, there is a trend towards making things better, and most of the reform programs which countries do get into with the IMF or some other institution, they really point towards the deficiencies of your public financial management systems, both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side, because most of these countries also have a problem of corruption, and so there is a lot of leakage from the system, particularly from the budgetary system. And in South Asia, we need to tackle this issue, and since it's a common issue across South Asia, there is room for cooperation in this area to learn from each other's experiences. Plus, I think the digitalization of government in most countries, and in South Asia it is also happening that the government transactions are being digitalized, which means that with technology you can help to stop the leakage from the system. You can improve your tax compliance, you can improve your kind of, in Pakistan for example, we have an issue of the tax net, that very few people are in the direct taxes net, even though everybody pays through their noses for indirect taxes. Direct taxes has a different methodology for collection, and our institutions are generally very weak and they need to be strengthened. So to answer your question, yes, we are behind the world in terms of technology and our institutional growth, which we need to focus on and make sure that we are able to have robust institutions who can collect the revenue so that these debts requirements are reduced to a certain extent.
So, Dr. Shah, if I may come in, and yes, I'm glad you were talking about Pakistan, because I wanted to ask you specifically in the context of Pakistan. Do you think that Pakistan's moving in the right direction in this manner? Imran Khan, of course, came into office saying that he wanted to fight against corruption. He has delivered on some of those promises, of course, already. Do you think that we're moving on the right trajectory within Pakistan specifically?
I think you have to, this is a trend of the times. Corruption is a very big story all over the world, and particularly now in Pakistan, Imran has won the election on a main plank of doing something about corruption. So I think that's a right step. But we have to be very careful that when we are rooting out corruption, we don't root out investment as well, because there is a very close linkage between investment and corruption, because corruption is the government sector trying to get rents from the private sector and giving them some permissions. So if there is an unholy nexus between business and government in terms of corruption, of course that has to be broken. But the businesses have to be, I think, dealt in a slightly different manner from the way you deal with government institutions. For businesses, you have to nudge them towards the right path, by giving them a deregulated environment, a better investment climate, and less hurdles in their ability to do business in your country. So reducing the cost of business in any country, particularly in Pakistan, is a very important part of the challenge, and it is a big challenge because of the inefficiencies of the entire system. Your foreign sector or your trade sector suffers because of all these inefficiencies.
Right.
So I think it is something which we are moving in the right direction. And South Asia is now the most backward region in the world in terms of development. So if you compare East Asia with South Asia, South Asia has been left behind. And one of the reasons is that South Asia's investment climate was not up to the mark. Yet South Asia has probably the world's largest young population. And so as the working age population goes down in Europe and maybe in East Asia and even in China, South Asia has a chance of attracting these jobs. But that will only happen if you create the right investment climate for these big global companies to take advantage of the cheaper labor or the cheaper facilities.
If you allow me, Dr. Shah, I just want to put some of the points that you've just made, some very important points to Mr. Wijewardena. Mr. Wijewardena, I'm thinking at this point, as we've spoken about with Dr. Shah, one of the reasons, in fact, and I'm glad that he brought up the issue of corruption as well, one of the issues in Sri Lanka was begun with corruption, apparently, where President Sirisena said that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was involved in corruption of sorts. That seemed to be, at least, one of the root causes of the political crisis that we saw. Do you think, Mr. Wijewardena, that corruption is and plays a huge factor in the economy of Sri Lanka and in the fact that it still has all this debt, that there's leakage in the economy, etc.?
Of course, corruption is an endemic problem, not only in Sri Lanka, as Dr. Shah has mentioned, in all the countries in South Asia. Now, one of the factors which President Maithripala Sirisena mentioned about Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was that he was involved in this infamous central bank bond scam.
Yes.
And despite the fact that he had been advised by President to take action against the people who had committed that particular scam, President says that no action had been taken. So corruption is one of the critical issues, and corruption prevails not only in the political system but also in the administration bureaucracy as well. So as a result, whenever we want to spend money on any project or any matter, the actual cost that we have to incur is multiple times of the cost that it would have been undertaken at the normal levels. So as a result, taxpayers will have to pay that amount. Now, when it comes to the revenue of the government, Dr. Shah is very correct. We are behind with respect to technology, the use of technology for collection money for the government. The previous government, headed by Ranil Wickremesinghe, had started a new revenue administration management information system for the income tax. And even after 3 years, the system was not put in place. And it appears that it will take another 2 to 3 year time period for the entire system to be fully effective. So as a result, the total net tax network that we are having in Sri Lanka is much less than the potential tax network. So that is the reason why Sri Lanka is having a decline in trend in government revenue, which was around 30%, 20% of the GDP in early 1980s, has now come down to 13% of GDP. So because of this reason, and the government expenditure is increasing, there's a budget deficit. The deficit is funded out of borrowed money, and as a result, it has created a debt problem. So we have all kinds of these macroeconomic problems due to one reason. The reason is the inefficiency on the part of the government bureaucracy on one side, and the corruption that is prevailing among the politicians as well as the government bureaucrats has also reduced the amount that we could have raised by way of taxation. So these are actually endemic problems that we are having, and this particular allegation has to be leveled not only against the present government, but also the governments that had been there in the past in Sri Lanka.
Right. So do you feel, Mr. Wijewardena, that the political will exists right now within Sri Lanka to deal with these issues, as you've mentioned them, inefficiencies, corruption, etc., especially through a political crisis? Because as I was reading, bureaucracy in Sri Lanka is such that everything is continuing as normal for the average Sri Lankan citizen. He or she is not feeling this political crisis in his or her daily life at this point. That is because the bureaucratic process is such that they're simply not feeling the effects of this at this point in time, of course. Do you think that the political will exists on either side, be it Mr. Wickremesinghe or be it Mr. Rajapaksa?
Well, look, the civil society is pretty much more powerful now in Sri Lanka than it had been in the past. So as a result, no government would be able to sweep any of these corruption charges under the carpet. And as a result, they will have to investigate, or they might come to light, and as a result, the government will have to take the consequences of the action that they have taken. Okay. So the corruption levels can be reduced because of the voice of the civil society organization in Sri Lanka. But when it comes to reforming the government bureaucracy to make it a more efficient outfit to serve the nation, it's actually something which the government that has to come to power will have to take very concrete actions to persuade these people to serve deliver the products efficiently to the nation. In fact, you may recall at the time of independence and at the time the British left Sri Lanka, we had the best civil service in South Asia. But now, of course, the criticisms that are being leveled against the civil service mean that the services that we get are far from adequate. So any government that has to come to power, it is a must that they should reform the public service in the first instance, then introduce various legislations to check the corruption level in the government, and then only we can think of raising revenue and cutting down the budget deficits in order to relieve the government of the oncoming debt problem.
Okay, so Dr. Shah, you mentioned something earlier which I wanted to go back to, and that is about all of the above countries in this region working together. For example, when it comes specifically to corruption and possibly in other areas as well. Do you think that there should be a mechanism in place where the likes of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and others in this region are working and helping each other and guiding each other to work through their inefficiencies, through their corruption issues, etc.?
Well, I think it's lacking, even though we have a framework under which it can happen, and that framework is SARC. But unfortunately, because of India and Pakistan rivalry, SARC has not become very functional. But I think in a bilateral context, countries in South Asia can benefit from each other, particularly Sri Lanka and Pakistan can really share some know-how and information, and maybe also look at some exchange between our universities and our institutions which talk about such things. And I think this is something which is important. Having said that, I think we also need to learn from the rest of the world, because all these things have been encountered by one country or another over the last 50, 60 years. And most of these challenges have been addressed, and there are ways and means of addressing these challenges, and I think it depends more on political will than anything else to be able to do this. And I think the people of South Asia, particularly because they have been left behind in the race of development. When you look at the prosperity index in terms of per capita income, East Asia is way ahead of South Asia, maybe 10 times, 15 times differences in per capita income. Whereas they started off almost at the same level at independence. So I think that for South Asia particularly, it is a big catch-up kind of a situation, and the political will to do it. And also perhaps the political system has to be ensured that this can happen. Okay. Because our kind of democratic system does not have enough accountability built into it, into the system. It doesn't have enough accountability in terms of corruption and also in terms of performance. It's very easy to fudge performance, and but I mean, in a democracy, you can fool people some of the time, but you can't fool them all the time, and ultimately you have to pay the price.
Indeed. We'll leave it there at that as our final comment, Dr. Shah. Of course, we appreciate you coming into our studios today and sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate your insight, and we were, of course, also joined by our esteemed guest, Mr. Weerakoon Wijewardena, who is a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We appreciate your insight too, sir, speaking to us live via Skype. Both gentlemen on this program, ladies and gentlemen, agree that the default will not happen anytime soon right now in Sri Lanka. However, there are issues across South Asia and beyond even when it comes to inefficiencies, when it comes to corruption in economies, etc. So there is a need to definitely work together, to learn from each other, to learn from the world beyond as well, as Dr. Shah there mentioned at the end. And we, of course, hope that that political will, we see it further and further progressing towards such steps. We'll leave it there for now, but of course we appreciate you watching Scope tonight.